Hello, I'm Evely and I will tell you one story. Let's go. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the first subtle hint of something amiss crept into the fabric of my daily life. I, Marcus, had always prided myself on my rational mind and my ability to separate fact from fancy. Yet as I stepped out of my apartment building that day, a chill, not born of winter's bite but of something inexplicably other, brushed against my skin. The morning air carried a whisper, a silent announcement that nothing would ever be the same again. I tried to dismiss it as an overactive imagination fueled by a life too steeped in routine, but as the hours passed, the unsettling sensation deepened into an inescapable dread. My neighbors, once familiar and comforting, began to exhibit inexplicable, disturbing behaviors. Mrs. Carmichael, the gentle soul from next door who had always greeted me with a warm smile and twinkling eyes, now regarded me with an unnerving, emotionless stare. Her eyes, once kind and bright, now shimmered with a cold, unearthly glint that belied the warmth of her former self. Even the young couple on the floor below, who used to exchange trivial pleasantries about the weather and weekend plans, now communicated in short, clipped phrases and furtive glances. Their words, as if recited from a forbidden script, hinted at an ominous undercurrent, an undercurrent that spoke of a reality fraying at its edges. It wasn't just the people, the very environment seemed to betray a secret. The well-worn sidewalks and familiar park benches began to twist before my eyes, their contours blurring into grotesque shapes that defied logic. The comforting hum of the city was replaced by a discordant symphony of clanks, creaks, and distant, echoing thuds. In the pale light of dawn, the shadows appeared to dance with a life of their own, their movements erratic and sinister. I caught fleeting reflections in windows and puddles, distorted, spectral figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind only a lingering sense of foreboding. Desperate to find some rational explanation, I reached out to friends and acquaintances. However, my attempts were met with nervous laughter or vacant stares, as if my revelations were too monstrous to be acknowledged. Their reassuring words rang hollow, their eyes avoiding mine as if I were an unwelcome harbinger of doom. Alone with my mounting terror, I began to document every disquieting detail in a worn leather journal, the pages quickly filling with frantic, scrawled notes, a futile effort to capture a reality slipping away like sand through my fingers. That evening, the atmosphere in my cramped apartment turned from unsettling to outright menacing. As dusk fell, the walls themselves seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Faint scratches emerged on the plaster, forming indecipherable symbols that glowed with an eerie, phosphorescent light. I spent countless anxious minutes tracing their lines, trying to decipher a message hidden in the madness, only to be met with further confusion. Suddenly, a knock at the door shattered the silence. Heart-pounding, I opened it to discover nothing but a single, jet-black feather lying on the threshold, a silent omen of the horrors yet to come. In the days that followed, the anomalies escalated in both frequency and intensity. Time itself began to warp, minutes stretched into interminable eternities, while hours collapsed into jarring, disjointed fragments. I wandered through streets that had transformed overnight into labyrinthine corridors, where every familiar landmark contorted into an alien structure. At every turn, I sensed eyes watching from the periphery, shadowy silhouettes, barely perceptible yet undeniably real. These figures drifted along the edges of my vision, their hollow eyes and featureless faces reflecting back only an echo of my deepest fears. One particularly harrowing night, as I lay in a restless stupor, I was assailed by a chorus of soft, insistent murmurs that seeped through the thin walls of my apartment. The whispers, like the lamentations of a long-forgotten choir, recited fragments of despair and dread. Compelled by a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity, I crept from my bed and followed the sound down the dim corridor. The murmurs seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, as though the building were confessing its own tragic tale. In that moment, I understood the change was not superficial. It was as though the core of our existence was being rewritten by a force both ancient and malevolent. Haunted by these revelations, I embarked on desperate quests for answers. I scoured the forgotten corners of the city, a dilapidated library, an abandoned subway station, a mysterious antique shop laden with relics of a bygone era. In these shadowed enclaves, I uncovered cryptic manuscripts and faded legends that spoke of a cyclic calamity, a reality shift that recurred through the ages to unmake and remake the world. Each discovery deepened the terror. The more I learned, the more I feared that the shifting reality was an inevitable, all-consuming force that would soon claim every trace of the familiar. Late one night, while poring over a brittle, centuries-old tome by the trembling light of a solitary candle, I sensed an overwhelming presence behind me. The air grew heavy with an unspoken menace, and I felt as though unseen eyes were prying into the recesses of my mind. When I turned, a shadow, a dark, indistinct silhouette flitted at the edge of the light before vanishing into the darkness. In that fleeting moment, the truth crystallized in my mind. The reality shift was not a mere aberration, but an invasion, an insidious incursion of an unfathomable horror into the very essence of life. Now, as I record these moments in trembling script, I stand on the precipice of a chasm whose depths I dare not imagine. Every heartbeat is a countdown toward an uncertain fate, every whispered echo a reminder that the world I once knew is crumbling into chaos. I share these words as a desperate warning, a final testament of a man caught between sanity and the inexorable pull of an ever-shifting nightmare. I fear that in the next heartbeat, as the shadows lengthen and the unseen force draws ever nearer, the fragile veil of reality will shatter completely, leaving only terror, despair, and the unknown in its wake. I close this first chapter of my descent into madness with the chilling certainty that there is no escape from the looming darkness. The shift has begun, and I, alone in my awareness, stand witness to a slow, inexorable undoing of all that we hold dear. The world as I knew it had disintegrated into a nightmare beyond imagining. As the days bled together into an endless haze of terror and disorientation, I, Marcus, felt reality itself buckle and shatter. Each morning, I awoke to a new horror, a fragmented existence where time, space, and even human nature were nothing more than malleable constructs under the sway of an insidious force. The streets, once teeming with life and familiar faces, were now populated by hollow, distorted reflections of those I once knew. Their eyes were empty voids, their smiles twisted into grotesque masks that belied the terror simmering just beneath the surface. I remember the day when the transformation escalated beyond recognition. In a desperate bid to escape the suffocating grip of my crumbling reality, I ventured into the heart of the city, seeking answers or perhaps a semblance of the ordinary. The buildings themselves seemed to twist and warp with every step, their facades bleeding shadows that writhed like living things. I passed a row of storefronts, their windows now darkened pits, and in one, I saw a figure I once recognized, a friend, perhaps standing perfectly still under a flickering neon sign. I approached, heart pounding in my ears, only to find the figure dissolving into a cascade of oily black liquid, leaving behind an echo of whispered laughter that clawed at my sanity. Desperation drove me to the hidden corners of the city, places forgotten by time. In an abandoned hospital, I discovered corridors that defied the laws of physics. Long-forgotten wards stretched into endless passageways where light struggled to penetrate the oppressive gloom. I could hear the faint, disjointed cries of lost souls echoing through the halls. In one such room, the air itself trembled with an unseen malice. I caught sight of a mirror, its surface rippling like disturbed water. When I peered into it, I did not see my own reflection. Instead, I witnessed a montage of grotesque images, the faces of loved ones contorted into monstrous visages, limbs twisting into unnatural angles, and eyes that glowed with a malevolent intelligence. It was as though the mirror was revealing the true nature of the altered reality, a reality where every human emotion was perverted into an instrument of dread. The city had become a labyrinth of horror, each corner concealing unspeakable secrets. Night after night, I was pursued by inexplicable sounds, a rhythmic scraping, as if unseen claws were inscribing maddening symbols on the walls of my mind. At times, I believed I was being followed by something both human and inhuman, a creature that wore the guise of a friend one moment and a nightmare incarnate the next. The whispers of the wind seemed to speak in a language that defied comprehension, murmuring dark promises of oblivion and eternal suffering. I began to suspect that these voices were not external at all, but the echoing remnants of my own fractured thoughts, a mind slowly succumbing to the pervasive horror. One evening, as dusk merged into a suffocating midnight, I stumbled upon a gathering in an old, derelict square. Figures, their faces obscured by tattered hoods, circled around a burning effigy that seemed to be alive with writhing shadows. They chanted in a tongue that resonated with primordial dread, their voices melding into a single, droning incantation that vibrated through the very bones of the earth. I tried to slip away unnoticed, but the moment I stepped into the circle, time itself splintered. The ground beneath me convulsed, and I felt as if invisible hands were prying my soul from my body. In that excruciating moment, I saw visions of worlds beyond our own, realms of despair where the fabric of existence was torn asunder by an unfathomable malice. When the vision receded, I was left trembling in the center of that cursed assembly, my mind awash with terror and a gnawing certainty that the reality shift was an irreversible, all-consuming phenomenon. The further I delved into this nightmare, the more the boundaries between self and other, sanity and madness, blurred into nothingness. I began to experience horrifying lapses in memory, fractured moments where I lost control of my actions only to later discover that I had wandered through dark alleys or stood motionless in the rain-soaked streets, staring blankly into an abyss that beckoned me onward. Each episode left me with a lingering sense of violation, as though a part of me had been siphoned off into that other, malevolent realm. The people around me, now twisted incarnations of their former selves, seemed to actively avoid acknowledging the horror. Their vacant stares and forced smiles were but feeble attempts to mask an overwhelming terror, as if they were complicit in some dark, unspeakable ritual that had condemned us all. In a final bid to reclaim a fragment of the life I once knew, I returned to my apartment, a sanctuary that had, until recently, offered a modicum of comfort. I barricaded the door and sat before my journal, its pages filled with frantic scribbles of dread and despair. As I scrawled the latest account of my descent into madness, the room began to shudder violently. The walls trembled, and from the corners emerged faint silhouettes that moved with an unsettling deliberation. I realized with a sinking certainty that the change was no longer confined to the world outside. It had seeped into my very sanctuary, infiltrating the walls, the floor, even the air I breathed. The oppressive atmosphere became a sentient entity, whispering dark secrets and revelations that defied all rational thought. At that moment, I understood that there was no return to normalcy, no safe haven from the relentless onslaught of this reality shift. It was an irreversible invasion, a slow, inexorable collapse of everything familiar into an abyss of horror. As the last vestiges of my former life dissolved into the encroaching darkness, I realized that my solitary awareness was both a curse and a mercy. The knowledge of what had been lost and what was irrevocably transformed would forever haunt me. And so, with trembling hands and a heart laden with despair, I record these final words as a testament to a reality unmade, a reality consumed by an ancient, malevolent force that spared no soul from its insidious embrace. The collapse was complete. Every whisper, every shadow, every fleeting glimpse of what once was now served as a grim reminder that the world I once knew had vanished. All that remained was the cold, unyielding terror of an existence forever transformed, a ceaseless descent into an unfathomable darkness from which there was no escape. Thank you very much, and see you all in the next video.